All right, guys, welcome back. Today, I am doing something a little bit different, and I'm excited to share this fully functional color grading UI that I built and used for myself. And I'm going to walk through the component today, as well as a couple of the different ways and techniques that I use it, kind of my go-to color correction. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I created the component, and then I'll drop it, and it'll be available to everybody on my Patreon, as well as available for purchase if you're not into subscriptions. Um, yeah, so I wanted to create this because I do a lot of color correction and it can make such a big difference. We can just take a look. So I have this, my fluid simulation, uncolor corrected right now. And then we can see, you know, the versatility of these different wheels, as well as kind of the UI elements being able to correct. So overall, and then we have these like master down at the bottom, um, which is great. And then of course there's the gain and the offset as well. And so that's fun. And you can see, there's some pretty cool gems to be found, especially when we start combining some of these different elements. And then we do the lift. Yeah, like that's pretty cool. However, I find myself using these wheels less and using some of the other features a little bit more. One of those is the exposure curve. And we also have some sliders down here. So I really like the exposure curve. And I find myself a lot of times kind of pulling the exposure down on my darks. And then the mids kind of bringing up a little bit. Maybe bringing this down and this down here. Let's see, nice, okay, cool. Maybe a little bit too bright at the very top, just like that. And I think that is pretty nice. And it's a good way to go through illustrating the interface, which will let you both click and drag via render picking on the actual little points on the curve, which is great. But then you can also just use these guys to move. And in addition to that, all of these parameters are going to be parameters on the actual tox itself, which will let you animate things with chops if you want to do that, or just have a different way of accessing the interface. A couple other things we got. We have a button to open the viewer. We have scopes set up, which are cool, kind of pulling the RGB channels apart and overlaying them on the graph. And then this is on post. So if, for example, we go back here and start messing around, we can see the impacts on our different channels of these different applications. We have a reset all button, which I've already used, as well as, like I said, these reset buttons. What else do we have? This button to toggle between the curves and the scopes. Let's put this back maybe. And then one of the areas that we haven't looked at yet is going to be here, which are kind of just like your more general color grading options: hue, saturation, hue shifting. Whoa. Um, sRGB, color space, temperature, which I do really like a lot. And then sharpening, or kind of like bringing out details. I'll reset all of that again. What else do we have? We have also RGBCMY, which if you enable, you can then use. There's a bunch of different, you're essentially setting up bands for each of the different color bands. So a lot of times if I'm working for a client, I'll be working with creative directors or compositors or something that are more used to working kind of like the Photoshop color grading or color space, and they'll say something like, okay, we like this, but bring the cyan a little bit down, or make a specific adjustment to only the yellow. And there are ways you can do that in TouchDesigner, but I didn't find any that I really liked. And so I built this. However, we can see this takes a little bit of time to cook. And so I have this toggle, because if we have it toggled off, then we're just not using that at all. So you can decide whether or not you want the performance hit of using these different kind of channel-based filters. Again, we have our exposure. This one is probably, yeah, very evident there. The shadow's a little bit less so. Specular. And so what else have we got? That's kind of it for the overall functionality. I have all of these, again, broken into parameters. I'll reset them all again. And as you probably noticed by now, one of my first go-tos is really going to be just attacking the different black, dark, and then kind of mid-tone and shadow exposures first. And maybe if I use a movie file in and we look at a bit of a different source, maybe like this one could be good. Can take a look at that. So one of my first go-tos is going to be first addressing the black and dark exposure, which you'll see don't make a big difference, but if you have some dark areas, they will. And then I turn up the highlights so we get some more pop, as well as the specular, which goes up a lot. And then the midtone comes down normally. And the shadow and master kind of adjusts to taste, which is already looking a little bit better compared to our input. And then from there, I like to sometimes adjust the contrast, and I'll like pull the gamma down often, and maybe sometimes at the same time add a little bit of lift. This I think could use not that much reset, just like the slightest bit more blue maybe. And then I'll saturate it just a little bit, I'll sharpen it a little bit, and yeah, pulling this sRGB down also. And then the contrast pivot is a nice kind of like micro adjustment to the contrast. So this is my last touch, and to me, this is popping a lot more than this, our raw input. So that is kind of a quick example of how I would apply this. And if we look at the scopes, we can see, well, generally I try and have these not crashing out of the top, but because there's some specular reflection in this image, you actually kind of do want that full, so I'm okay with that, actually, as a last pass. And now I will talk through a little bit of how the component is set up for those interested. But for those of you that aren't interested, you can just go and start using it. Good luck. Hope you enjoy. I will be making some updates to this, performance updates, more UI updates and stuff like that as I go. But I wanted to get this out before the holidays because I'm traveling and doing some different projects and things. And so I wanted to do this before I forgot and get it out in the world. All right, so looking at the component itself, I want to say thank you to these people who have ported different elements of this, either the exposure shaders or the color wheels, into the TouchDesigner format. But I have basically rebuilt everything from the ground up using some of the same design elements. Here we have our exposure curves. And so this is basically keeping track of our data, just pulling from the parameters. And then we get all of our exposure data into two different dots that get read into our exposure shader as arrays. The exposure shader is there. You can go look for it if you want, but I'm not going to get into the code on this one. Then we have the RGBCMY, which again is a separate layer that can be enabled. I don't have the UI set up for this yet because with all of these different zones, it's a bit more of a complicated UI, and I don't really use it that much unless a client's asking for it specifically. So the best way to interact with that is just via these parameters, and we can, well, yeah. And then we have another shader, which has all of the kind of more like normal color grading levels. And again, noting where the shader is adapted from. Now, the most interesting part of this build is the UI, definitely. And so we can look at each of those in turn, and we'll still have a pretty brief tutorial. So these scopes, I will credit the original creator of the TouchDesigner component. I haven't really done much for these scopes, but it is pretty interesting. So if we'll see what's going on, we're looking at basically a couple different renders, which are cool. And the renders are using our images as data to actually render these scopes, which I think is really interesting. There's some good stuff to dive into if you're interested in the GLSL. It's where most of the meat is happening. But again, not going to go too in depth. I just wanted to call it out as a place for some interesting exploration. Our wheels, I've set up with a replicator, and each one's kind of self-contained, running off of a table that populates it. Oh, one thing that I forgot to mention is that you can change the font. I have it wired up, for example, let's say I like Consolas, the like kind of monotype, and you can see these fonts change. These don't because the spacing is a little bit more nuanced, but you can get kind of crazy if you want to on what your fonts are. Anyway, yes, each one of the wheels is kind of its own deal. And inside, there's a lot going on. Not really a lot going on. There's a very simple script that moves the circle around based on clicking and dragging a panel comp that is pointed at this specific wheel. So that's how I get the XY position of the slider. And I took a lot of this functionality from the original build and just kind of made it look a little bit more like the rest of my environment. And so then I have 4 of these bad boys that are all linked up, and then I grab the parameters of the output and use the parameters of the output with a chop execute that does the bidirectional linking, so that as I move these, our parameters update. And as I move these, well, I guess that is actually broken, so never mind about that. But it does update this way. And some of the other ones, like I mentioned on the exposure, are fully bidirectional. But like I said, I don't use the circles as much, so those are not. This is just a quick op viewer to look at the output image. Here we have our exposure curves. Our exposure curves are basically a little render pick setup. So I'm rendering these dots and this chop 2, which is basically just like a line interpolated from the curves, from the stops on the curves. And then I have a render pick with a multi-touch in using my mouse on this window. You can see it's activated there. And so I have the render pick that allows me to, in the callbacks here in my extension, move. In this case, I move the where is it? Exposure. Yeah, okay. So here I'm using the render pick to actually directly alter the parent parameters that you see. And so all of the rendering is basically done based on these parameters. So my render pick just has to update the parameter value, which is actually really simple to do. And then everything else is moved appropriately. And there's a separate piece of logic that moves the dots based on render picking, clicking, and dragging. And you can see all of that in the extension here. It's less than 100 lines total. It's not super complicated. Sliders, nothing too crazy to see here. But I do have the sliders, each of them. This is, I guess, the most important thing is that each one of these sliders takes care of updating its parent parameter itself. Wherever that is. Which one is this? Yeah, there we go. So basically, there's just par executes that on change update the parent parameter that corresponds to the name of this slider's component. And so by doing that, I remove the need for more bidirectional like chop executes, and it's kind of all nicely contained just in there. And then I just have the same thing applied to both of these. And then last, I just have my buttons, each of which are wired up to a different chop execute that hits a parameter, basically, for the reset, the scopes, and the curve changing. So that's it. Hopefully everybody can make some good use of this. Like I said, I'll be releasing some updates. I'm not going to say they're going to be like super consistent or frequent, but I will be making the changes that I made for myself, in addition to some performance upgrades that will allow you to bake everything into the most performant version of the shaders possible for running in real time, and maybe even exporting to LUTs themselves. But that is on the roadmap. So let me know some feedback. Hopefully you enjoy using this. Hopefully it's easy to use. And if there's any issues, let me know. Till then, hope you enjoy and hope you have a good time around the holidays. Don't remember to take some time to just relax.